So we'll try again on the Sunday Christ. So if you walk into the church at Michael Church Exley in Herefordshire, you'll find you're confronted with what looks rather like a page from the catalogue of a medieval hardware store. After you've looked a second time, you'll see the picture of Christ in the middle. Around him are the implements of daily life in a medieval village, many of them apparently piercing or wounding him. This is one of over 20 images of Christ, known as Christ of the Trades or the Sunday Christ, which don't represent a biblical or apocryphal scene, but are moralities. Pictures aimed to direct the life of the spectator into the right way. I've been fascinated by these paintings for about 45 years. Attending a service at St. Just Church as a student, I caught sight of this painting and I was intrigued. Identifying the items presented a challenge that far outweighed the interest of the sermon. Consulting the guidebook after the service, I found that this painting was not unique, but one of many. I just hadn't seen any before. All of them show a figure surrounded by implements. While the implements are not formally arranged, they often seem to be attacking the central figure and may actually pierce or cut it. Occasionally, as in this one from Biella in Italy, other figures are shown, though this is relatively rare. So you can see the shopkeeper down at the bottom, a lady looking in a mirror, and a gentleman looking at her with lustful intent. More rarely still, it appears in other media. This is a piece of stained glass from St. Neot in Cornwall. And this unique relief figure in alabaster, thought to be English, is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Usually, the central figure shows Christ as the man of sorrows, as in this lost painting at Llanivit in Cornwall. But occasionally, he is clothed in a mantle, as at Oaksey, though this particular figure may well be a painting of the resurrection Christ with Mary Magdalene, overpainted to make a Sunday Christ. The whole shape of it is a bit odd. Usually, small groups of these paintings are found in about 50 churches in mainland Europe, largely in upland areas. They're grouped like this in largely Catholic countries suggests the patchiness of their occurrence in Britain is not simply the result of destruction under Henry VIII and Cromwell. 23 churches in England and Wales have recorded paintings of this image, and 38 more are mentioned as having an image of St. Sunday. Possibly there were once many more. The paintings are distributed in 5 small groups: in Cornwall, the Welsh Marches, the Cotswolds, the South Downs, and East Anglia. The earliest examples are from Europe, dating from about 1340. And the earliest British examples are probably the Cotswold group, dating from some 50 years later. The rest seem to be 15th or 16th century work, but are extremely difficult to date. It's noteworthy that most of these groups are centred around port areas, the exception being the Cotswold group, which were of course the centre of the international wool trade. Manorial records of that area show a mortality during the Black Death of about 65%. Much higher than average, and it puts COVID into proportion. It's tempting to see the distribution as mirroring the impact of the Black Death, and in fact this could be argued from the location of most of the European examples. They're around the area where the plague first hit Europe. All the paintings surviving in Britain are found inside the church, though the St. Sunday painting at High Wycombe was said to be on Wycombe Church, and many of the continental examples are found on the outside of the building. Within the church, they're almost invariably in the aisles and nave, and usually opposite or visible from the main door, thus often close to St. Christopher paintings. This may suggest that, like paintings of St. Christopher, they were designed to be visible to those walking past the church and not intending to enter it. The image of Christ, surrounded by equipment of work and leisure, arrives about 1350 as a completely new motif. Thought to be the oldest surviving example is that in Oberzaring in Austria, dating from about 1340 to 50. The figure on the right is St. Oswald of Northumbria, more popular in the Tyrol than in England. It's tempting to assume the motif has some literary source, possibly a devotional poem or some mystical vision, but no single such text has come to light. Instead, it seems to have evolved from a range of different sources. The Sunday Letter is probably the earliest, a document purporting to have been written by Christ himself. It condemned working on the Sabbath and is first referenced in 584. But it continued circulating well into the 15th century and warned of divine punishment for running errands, shaving or cutting hair, washing, brewing, and baking. The Man of Sorrows, Christ shown as a living man bearing the marks of his passion, was one of the most popular devotional images of the Middle Ages. It originates in the 12th century Byzantium and gradually spread through Italy into Europe, gaining prominence during the Black Death and becoming completely general by the mid-14th century. The legend of the Mass of St. Gregory grew up shortly after this. While Gregory celebrated Mass, Christ is supposed to have appeared on the altar at the moment of elevation, filling the chalice with blood from his wounds, thus emphasizing the doctrine of the real presence of his body and blood in the Eucharist. The image of Gregory kneeling before the altar, where among the sacred vessels, Christ stands as the Man of Sorrows, surrounded by the implements of his passion, the weapons of Christ, quickly became popular. And you can see in this illustration the resemblance between that and the Sunday Christ. Now, early interpreters of these paintings saw Christ surrounded by the emblems of his saints and attempted with limited success to link individual implements with specific saints. Thus, first reports on the painting at Llanivit saw a pair of pincers as the emblem of St. Dunstan and the hand on a book as that of St. Barnabas. To be honest, it looks more like a legal deed than a book to me. Later scholars saw the tools arranged as a glory around the figure of Christ and considered those tools that appear to pierce the figure of Christ as being the product of hasty or unskilled painting, conveying the idea of Christ as chief of all craftsmen and source of all the arts in the world. They were seen as the expression of the ideas of the mendicant preachers who upheld the virtue of the simple working folk, the righteous poor. This arts and crafts interpretation of the paintings, where the work of farmers and craftsmen is seen as fundamental to the state of the world, and in the handiwork of their craft is their prayer, proved remarkably popular. The tenacity of these ideas is remarkable. There seems a real reluctance to abandon an idea of merry England, where the jolly peasant and the pure handicraftsman work together to glorify God. And the Christ of the Trades continued as a motif in churches well into the 20th century, as in the east window of Sancreed, which is the one I'm showing here. Here Christ blesses not only St. Andrew and Peter, emblematic of seafarers and fishermen, but a shepherd, a sower, a daffodil harvester, and a miner, representing the trades of that particular village. The key to the interpretation of these paintings lay in the continental examples, which made the message of these paintings as a warning and condemnation of Sabbath breaking fully apparent. Unless the English examples could be seen as utterly unrelated to those of the rest of Europe, the conclusion was forced that these paintings represented Christ re-crucified by those who failed to keep Sunday sacred. This painting, at San Miniato in Florence, bears the inscription, "Whoever does not observe the Holy Sunday and has not devotion to Christ, God will give him eternal damnation." I rest my case. It's clear that in England, figures and paintings existed representing a figure known as St. Sunday. In Morbath, the churchwarden's accounts record the installing of a tabernacle for St. Sunday in 1530. Here, St. Sunday seems to have been a statue rather than a wall painting, perhaps something like the alabaster figure now in the V&A. There's a reference to the blessed arm of Sweet St. Sunday in a list of highly implausible relics in the satirical play The Friar and the Pardoner in 1533. The list includes the blessed arm of Sweet St. Sunday, and whosoever is blessed with this right hand cannot speed amiss by sea nor by land. The great toe of the Holy Trinity, and whosoever once doth it in his mouth take, he shall never be diseased with the toothache. Here is another relic eke, a precious one, of All Hallows the blessed jawbone, which relic without any fail against poison chiefly doth prevail. Now, the point of these relics is clearly they can't exist, which strongly suggests that St. Sunday cannot be the representation of any individual saint, though people have argued for St. Dominica and various other saints. The development of the Sunday Christ as a morality painting from the devotional images of the Man of Sorrows and the Arma Christi seems to be linked with the arrival of the Black Death. In England, they're found in the area at the centre of the wool trade and the areas around many of the major ports, in areas where the mortality seems to be particularly high. Arriving in Dorset in June 1348, the epidemic spread particularly fast from the ports and in areas of international trade, though ultimately the whole country was affected. The effects of the Black Death were varied. Firstly, there was a huge reduction in the population, especially in the cities. Many communities were abandoned altogether, often leaving churches as the only surviving buildings, as here at Hartley Mordit in Hampshire. Nothing remains of the village of Hartley Mordit, but the church is still in use, but only in the summer, as it has no power, no heating. It also meant an acute shortage of labour. Skilled craftsmen in particular were in great demand and could pretty well name their price. They moved to where the wages offered were highest, leaving the poorer areas struggling. This also led to inflation, and attempts were made to control wages as well as movement of labour, and to ensure that anyone under the age of 60 worked. The king was particularly scathing in his writ to the Bishop of Winchester. And therefore we entreat you that the premises in every of the churches and other places of your diocese, which you shall think expedient, you do cause to be published, directing the parsons to exhort and invite their parishioners by salutary admonitions to labour, as the present necessity requireth, and that you do likewise moderate the stipendiary chaplains of your said diocese, who, as it is said, do now in like manner refuse to serve without an excessive salary, and compel them to serve for their accustomed salary, as behoveth them, under pain of suspension and interdict. Sounds rather like the Diocese of York. The listing of specific workers, such as butchers, reapers, cordwainers, ploughmen, goldsmiths, brewers, blacksmiths and saddlers, tailors, tawers, carpenters, carters, and fishmongers, suggests they may be perceived particularly difficult to get hold of. It's interesting to notice how often the tools of these particular trades appear on the Sunday Christ paintings. Another result of the Black Death was a huge increase in the amount of religious observance demanded by the church. The Black Death seemed to strike as God's visitation on a sinful world, but more particularly on a sinful church that had been neglecting a humble lifestyle. There were outbreaks of religious hysteria, such as the flagellants, and awareness of death brought about increased devotion to saints, especially those associated with miraculous cures, and a rise in pilgrimage to their shrines, together with an increased awareness of purgatory and the resultant sale of indulgences. New churches were built, which of course needed funding. The new perpendicular style evolved. It was easier to produce in bulk. Days of obligation on which work was not permitted increased greatly in number during the 14th century, from about 60 days in the year to about 100. So not only was the state demanding more work, but the church was requiring more attendance and more money. It's hardly surprising a London shoemaker, James Cornelis, charged with Sabbath breaking, tartly responded in court, "I will keep my shop open and sell my ware, as long as Master Vicar standeth taking his offering." What gives these paintings their significance and appeal is the light they throw on the life of the community. The tools are a real indication of what was going on to arouse the indignation of the parish priest. Given that the tools are not always clear, though the painters often use colour to show materials, and not always easy to identify or to scale, I've tried to give an indication of the lives of these communities by using medieval illustrations of the people we're dealing with. One wonderful source is the House Book of the 12 Brothers of Nuremberg, the records of a charity set up in the late 14th century, which gave 12 homeless men a year accommodation and food, and taught them a trade. Endearingly, they recorded each one with a portrait of them in their new work. The fifth brother was Hans, and he was a sawyer. Another source is a set of songbooks from 1542 from Bruges, and now in the Municipal Library of Cambrai. The author seems to have been a compulsive watercolour doodler with a lively and at times surreal sense of humour. Both give an unusually clear and attractive picture of ordinary people living their day-to-day lives. I'm now going to start to look at individual churches. The Church of Apney St Mary is an enchanting little church in the middle of nowhere, a mile or so from where the village now stands. Before the Black Death, the village surrounded the church, but in the 1350s, the population moved to higher ground, leaving the church to its fate. It became overgrown with ivy and was more or less lost until 1913, when the ivy was removed. It is still known locally as the Ivy Church. Inside, it's largely untouched since the village moved. The walls are lavishly painted. Athene Rice comments, there's a lot of paint, but very few paintings. On the south wall is a confusion of painting. 12th century masonry painting underlies the late 14th century Christ, together with sundry tools and figures. This is probably the earliest of the figures in this paintings in this country. The painting is in poor shape, and it's hard to distinguish more of Christ than his head and his foot. He appears to be dressed in a bordered upper garment. Pigments used are red and yellow ochre. The objects are largely outlined in red and left white, but at the bottom, yellow colouring survives on areas representing wood, and a reddish background is visible, suggesting that at some time this area was protected, possibly by panelling. It's far and away the best preserved bit. A few tools show up well. You may be able to pick out blacksmith's tongs, a hunting horn, and a wheel. Less easy to see are a ball of wool, a shuttle, and possibly a lucette. Round the head of Christ are a pick, an axe, and a comb. And at the bottom, we can see a butcher's cleaver. This painting is unusual for England in showing figures rather than just tools. Was the painter perhaps getting at individuals or just showing off? This is far more skillfully painted than most of the examples. At the top right, we have a workman truing up an arrow. He seems to be holding a spoke rounder in his left hand. It seems to be a blunt arrow used for small game. It was forbidden to use sharp arrows in royal forests, as they could be used for deer, which were the king's property. So blunts could be used for small animals. Especially those with skins that were valuable, which meant that, because the blunt arrow meant that it didn't damage the pelt. At the opposite side of the painting is a man with a longbow. Is he the customer for the arrow maker? The man at the foot of Christ is playing bagpipes. This purely secular instrument is associated with shepherds and is often used in humorous marginalia in manuscripts. Very raucous medieval bagpipes. Activities in the community include a lot of textile work. There is a fair amount of skilled craft, such as wheel making and perhaps saddlery. Hunting clearly played its part, with the hunting of small game clearly indicated. Music and drinking seem to have been an issue, but there's no indication of gambling. Knives and the cleaver may indicate the cutler and a butcher, the mattock a gardener, and tongs a blacksmith. All in all, Ampney St Mary seems to have been a small and self-sufficient rural community. We now move to St Andrew, Netherwallop, and this church stands on a steep chalk slope at the edge of the village, and parts of it date back to the late Saxon era, probably the first decades of the 11th century. From the 12th to the 15th century, it was extended time and again. While much has changed, the original Saxon church form is still clearly visible, and the east wall of the nave still retains the earliest wall paintings in England in situ. But on the south arcade, there is a somewhat damaged, but still fairly spectacular Sunday Christ. What remains of this large painting of the 15th century is located in the spandrel of the south arcade. Surface preservation is patchy, but it must have been a fine painting. A slightly camp Christ is shown with arms akimbo and with a nimbus of crown of thorns. His left hand shows a nail mark, and small wounds with drops of blood are apparent on his leg and torso. The implements visible include a weaving shuttle and a set of scales. Below the scales are a wrapping iron for basketry and a shovel, and lower down an auger and a mill rind. While this presumably represents the miller, it is noticeable the local family of Miller carried the mill rind as a charge on their coat of arms. Under Christ's feet is possibly a plough, while between his legs are a horseshoe, a half-moon leatherworker's knife, a chisel, a billhook, and an awl. As we might expect, Netherwallop appears to have been a prosperous place. Less obviously, it seems also to have been a hard-working one. Here there is no evidence of gambling, drinking, music, or other leisure pursuits. Textiles were being produced. Spinning, weaving, and cloth finishing are all in evidence. Woodworkers are evident, and trades include gardeners, farmers, and merchants. Specialist trades include farriers, shoemakers, coopers, and basket makers. Overall, Nether Wallop was clearly a sizable, prosperous rural community, as it remains to this day. St Mary Purton, not far away from Nether Wallop. Purton Church is a fine building begun in the 13th century and completed in the 15th. It stands among a collection of handsome stone buildings, the manor house and farm buildings at the heart of this old part of this Wiltshire village. It's far and away the most substantial Sunday Christ church in England. The Sunday Christ is located on the south wall beside and above the south door, so easily missed when one first enters the church. The right-hand side of the painting is missing. It may still exist under the Georgian royal arms. This is a much more competently painted figure than many, executed in red and yellow with a pink background. Christ has a cruciform nimbus and stands with his hand displaying a large wound, while wherever the surface of the body survives, there are small blood droplets. Some commentators see him as a beardless youth, but it seems more likely that almost all the face has been abraded. In the top corner, rather surprisingly, St. Peter stands complete with keys and a papal tiara at the gate of heaven, admitting the souls of the righteous. One has to wonder whether the figure was flanked by a hell on the other side of it. There are some interesting items portrayed here, like the mill, possibly for fulling, though probably for hammering sheet metal. Other tools include an axe, a mattock, and what might be a plough blade, and a set of armourer's shears. This illustration shows the scale of how big those shears would have actually been. These were used for cutting sheet metal. There's also a horse bit, a pair of scissors, and what's probably a pruning tool of some kind. Purton at the time of this painting, probably the late 14th century, seems to be a prosperous place, borne out by the scale of the church. The mill argues a degree of industrialisation and the presence of at least one serious entrepreneur. Merchant entrepreneurs invested in the building of fulling mills in hilly areas, where falling water was abundant and the land unused by local lords. They bought wool from sheep-raising nobles at better prices than the towns could offer, got it spun and woven cheaply in villages, then mass-produced cloth using the fulling mills. Some renegades even tried to sneak out woven cloth from the cities to get it fulled outside the town. We know this because there are laws against it. The spinners, weavers, and fullers' guilds in the towns were furious. The heavy armour shears also argue rather more industry than usual in a rural community. The mattock and axe are the classic tools of the agricultural labourer, a general worker often employed by the day, and the plough blade continues the agricultural theme. The bit, major empire bridler, or simply someone working with horses, such as a carrier. The scissors are probably those of a tailor. All in all, we have a picture of a relatively wealthy and sophisticated community, doing well out of the shortages of labour, of skilled labour brought on by the Black Death. Another of this Cotswold cluster is Oaksey. It's in the middle of the old village and the church was originally built in the 13th century. It was added to in the 14th and 15th centuries and is surrounded by old buildings, including the village school. Oaksey is a large and prosperous village and seems always to have been so. The Black Death saw the beginning of a decline in numbers and wealth that continued into the 15th century. It's on the south wall of the side aisle that the medieval paintwork survives, though there's much later painting in the church as well. 3 large paintings have emerged from a huge number of different layers of medieval paint. There is a fine St. Christopher and a very damaged painting showing either a Man of Sorrows or St. Edmund. The eastern panel is the Sunday Christ. This Sunday Christ is not the clearest picture to disentangle. What is immediately clear is there's a lot of very elegant foliage painting which seems to overlie the whole thing, probably dating from the 16th century. There also seems to be the suspicion of a kneeling figure at the left, which, coupled with the unusual absence of wounds and the elegant mantle worn by Christ suggest this may originally have been a painting of Christ and Mary Magdalene in the garden, which was subsequently modified to portray the Sunday Christ. It does seem possible that the figure of Christ is holding a long hoe in his left hand, a tool often emblematic of a gardener. In the left-hand top corner, the tools are relatively clear, though some are very difficult to identify. A large scythe blade sweeps across the corner, and below it are fairly clearly a purse and a flagon. A shoemaker's half-moon knife and a turner's or carver's chisel are immediately visible at the left side below. Next to these is a Gothic harp. By the harp, there is a mason's trowel, and above that, what might be a water wheel, but might also be a gingerbread mould. The carefully drawn area below the purse is a mystery. Is it one item, a fancy sledge, or perhaps several small items, perhaps a pruning knife and a purse frame, together with a row of dip candles? I don't think anybody's very clear what, it's very carefully drawn, but what's going on? I do not know. You can see them in detail here. You may have a look and make up your own mind. In the lower half of the painting, things are less clear. Possibly it's less restored than the upper portion. However, we can still see clearly a number of items. There is a fine carpenter or turner's gouge beneath the trowel, a pair of fuller's shears, and a horseshoe. At the left, there are a pair of blacksmith's tongs, and below them a fine iron-shod spade. Little is clear further down, though there does appear to be a mirror just below the spade. This might be an adaptation of the halo belonging to Mary Magdalene. So Oaksey, like Purton, is revealed as a very prosperous community based around farming, but with a number of trades represented. In addition to the essential blacksmith, there's woodwork, leatherwork, and cloth processing going on. New buildings are going up, and there's time and money for some luxuries, such as a fancy purse, with opportunities for emptying it with a tavern, expensive musical instruments, and perhaps even gingerbread for feast days. In the V&A is a unique alabaster deep-cut relief of the Sunday Christ, acquired in 2010 for £25,000. Made in England, but recently located in Portugal, and made probably about 1500. The figure would have been placed at a door, or in a chapel, and is the only known English example. Christ wears a loincloth and a cloak, with a purse hanging from the front ties. On his head, he appears to be wearing a fancy hat. Tools shown include a chisel, an axe, a cooper's hoop driver, a pair of pliers, a leatherworker's half-moon knife, an awl, a large pot, possibly with a mixing spoon in it, a hammer, a buckle, a spoon, what's either a strainer or a tennis racket, a drawer knife, a wrapping iron, and a grass hook or sickle. Unlike most of these images, this would have been an expensive piece and probably made for a domestic context, perhaps a private chapel. It does serve, though, as a reminder that three-dimensional figures of St. Sunday may have been found in parish churches, as well as paintings and glass. The sort of man who might have owned a piece like this, Edward Grimston, died in 1478, was the son of Robert Grimston, who lived in Grimston, just down the road from us, and was the English ambassador at the court of the Duke of Burgundy. He died in 1478 and is buried in the church of Thorndon in Suffolk. We now move to East Anglia, in fact to Suffolk, the church of St. Ethelbert in Hesset. Hesset Church stands in the middle of the village in a large churchyard, and apart from the early 14th century chancel is 15th century. It retains its 15th century rood screen, together with a good deal of medieval seating, and the medieval layout with pews along the north and south walls. I should emphasize that when churches are open again, this really is a worthwhile church to visit. On the north wall, we find the 7 deadly sins with the Sunday Christ below it. The central figure of Christ is very unclear and does seem to have been deliberately scratched out. It seems likely that it dates from about 1490, when the north aisle was renovated. A dedication cross appears to overlie the bottom right corner, but presumably the painting works round the cross. There is an assemblage of implements surrounding the central figure, some more obvious than others. Very obvious on the left-hand side is the gridiron, and we can pick out an axe, an upturned jug, and a playing card. A sword, a chisel, a pair of fuller's shears, a scythe, and an auger, all fairly clear and easy to identify. The gridiron was primarily a staple of the kitchen, placed on the fire to grill fish and meat and sausages, and occasionally saints. However, it was also used as a primitive musical instrument, think washboard, and was played with a knife as part of rough music, especially associated with Twelfth Night and Mardi Gras. The loud metallic din was thought to drive away evil spirits, and in consequence, it developed a semi-magical reputation and was used in protective spells, here drawn on a porch ceiling. Next to the gridiron is a curious round object. A similar object is also shown in the painting at Oaksey. Any suggestions for exactly what it is will be gladly received. But a possibility is that it's suggested by this illustration of a gingerbread maker from the 15th century Nuremberg. It does bear a resemblance to some of those molds. Lower and to the right is another odd object, resembling a bass clef. I suspect it's the end view of a roll of cloth, as shown on the Biello Sunday Christ, and so associated with the shears. The wind instrument at Hesset is hard to identify with certainty. It appears to be made of wood, but shows no sign of finger holes. So possibly it's a shawm-type instrument or a wooden trumpet. The watchman from Nuremberg shows a similar instrument, but it's hard to see why he should be exempt, should not be allowed to work on Sundays. The shawm, being played in a domestic context, is more plausible, while the bombard, being played for dancing, looks just the sort of thing that should be banned on Sundays. And finally, this chap in a marginal picture looks as though it should be banned at all times. At the right-hand side is a wooden object, rectangular with a handle. At first sight, it looks like a hornbook, though these seem to have been rare prior to the invention of printing. It's also, again, difficult to see why children should not be allowed to read on Sundays. There are stories of these hornbooks being used as battledores for games, so that could be what's being referred to. More likely, though, it's a true battledore. The flat bat, used by women for laundry, and occasionally for other purposes. This is a misericord from Tewkesbury. An implement on the lower left side is a matter of guesswork. It might be a spade, but it does seem very elaborate. And it's possibly a curd cutter used in the making of hard storable cheeses. However, this bishop appears to be using a very fancy and elaborate spade for his relic gathering, so spade is the most likely answer. Another unusual implement which can possibly be identified is what appears to be a very high-end arquebus gun with fine spiraling on the barrel. It compares with these early 16th century Landsknecht's weapons from Europe, and if the identification is correct, must have been a very personal dig at one rather wealthy individual. So early 15th century Hesset is revealed as a lively and prosperous place, with probably at least one and more likely two seriously wealthy individuals in the community. These magnates, with their sword and arquebus, presumably encouraged the textiles industry from spinning to the production and sale of cloth. The spinning would no doubt have been done in the home, and other aspects of home life indicated here are laundry and cooking, both to be avoided on holy days. The fuller would no doubt have his own premises, as would the tailor with his rolls of cloth. Other skilled workers here were the wood turner and the baker, and they all depended on the agricultural labourers whose produce underpinned the life of the community. Here, there was obviously plenty of time and money for relaxation. The downturned jug argues a lively tavern, the playing card, gambling, and the shawm, the music and dancing, enjoyed by all. We move to St John's, Duxford. This church stands in the middle of Duxford village and is in the care of the Churches Conservation Trust. It dates from the late 12th century and was extended in the 14th and 15th centuries. In 1874, St John's became derelict. There is another church in Duxford, and inside the church is a melancholy place. It's been unused for too long to keep alive. What redeems the building is the wall painting, covering all periods from the 12th century to the 20th. On the eastern panel of the north wall is what remains of the Sunday Christ, a very faded painting where the central figure is all but completely lost. The painting is located at the east end of the north wall and dates from the late 15th century. The central figure can never have been very large in comparison with the surrounding objects, possibly a half figure of the Man of Sorrows comparable with that at Llanefydd, and the whole is enclosed in an elegant leafy border. The paints used were red and yellow ochre, and only the red really remains visible. Identifiable tools include a spade at the bottom right, a rake or wool comb, a flail, a gridiron, and a scythe. There's also a backgammon tables board. Given the very poor state of the painting, we can't give an accurate picture of life in this parish. Duxford ran to two parishes, and St John's seems to have been part of the Templar establishment here. If we're to judge by clergy mortality, the Black Death hit particularly hard in the Diocese of Ely, conservatively about 68% or over and 100% clergy. This would suggest that even agricultural labourers would have been in high demand, while those selling craft work would probably have moved to the towns. We can see evidence for agriculture, cooking, and gambling. It's possible that the spade and what might possibly be a pick represent quarrying. Clunch was quarried at Duxford for use in building. However, there's an absence of any specific craftsman indicated in this painting. The parish and its church appear to have been clinging on by the skin of their teeth, the start of the inevitable decline that led to closure. We now move down to Cornwall. St Willow's Church is tucked away in a little valley near Bude. It's a parish with history. At the introduction of the English prayer book in 1549, the people of Cornwall, many of whom knew no English, rose in arms at the imposition of this foreign innovation. And Simon Morton, vicar of Poundstock, was prominent among them. He was hanged at the market house in the town of Stratton for high treason on the 13th of October, 1549. Around the south door is a preserved area of wall painting. On the left hand, as at Hesset, we have a tree of the seven deadly sins, and on the right, the Sunday Christ. A third, smaller panel between the two has been suggested to be a weighing of souls. Clearly, these paintings are a carefully thought out scheme. There doesn't seem to have been any repainting when the church was restored, though the paintings were remounted on new plaster in 1970, when damage from Concord's sonic boom was feared. The large Sunday Christ seems to date from the late 15th century and is painted in ochre colours with grey-black outlines. Christ has a nimbus and appears to be stepping forward with extended arms. No wounds are visible today, but a painting of 1895 shows them, together with several tools no longer visible. It also shows the background to be liberally spattered with drops of blood. Tools shown at the top of the painting include a butcher's knife, a shuttle, a harrow, an awl, a mallet, a scythe handle, a flail, and a spade. Lower down, tools include an oar, scales, an axe, a wheat sheaf, a two-man saw, a chisel, a billhook, a sickle, currier's knife, a hammer, an adze and a peel. So at Poundstock, we found much less of a ranger activity than many communities. Life seems to be very much focused on farming, with seed time and harvest well represented. We also see the end stages of cattle farming, with butchers, scudders, scraping hair from skins before tanning, and leather workers. As one might expect from a seaside community, we see boatmen, presumably fishermen. Among the trades represented are carpenters, a weaver, and a baker. Poundstock seems to have been a community that is just getting by, little interest in or time for leisure. Now we move to St Just, right down in the far west of Cornwall. And the church is right in the middle of this small mining town, which is, until very recently, was a very busy and absolutely no frills sort of place. St Just's Church is a sizable 15th century building, mainly constructed in granite. There's evidence of early Christianity. St Sullivan is buried here. Oh, that's interesting. My apologies, that painted picture is really dreadful. I don't know what's happened to it. The Sunday Christ is on the north wall. A fairly large, once about 6 foot high figure, lacking both the top and bottom extremities. This image was enclosed within plain brownish red borders. Christ wears a vivid blue loincloth, and a single stream of blood flows from the wound in his side. There also seems to be a wound in his right foot, though the conservators in 1987 found no clear evidence of wounds on Christ's body. The hands and legs look particularly heavily restored, and the general quality of the painting is extremely poor, though it's hard to say whether this is the fault of the restorers or the original painter. The figure is outlined in dark red, while the tools are outlined in dark grey. A range of reds and greys is also used, together with malachite green and a vivid blue, presumably derived from copper, though it may be Victorian Prussian blue used in the restoration. As a copper mining area, Cornish wall paintings do tend to display a far wider colour palette than elsewhere. The black and white picture is as it appeared in 1940. Intriguing items, again, I've got real problems with the photos here, I do apologise, include a fishing boat with a trawl net and a large fish, and a quadrant, probably for navigation, though possibly a surveying tool associated with mining. You can see the sort of thing that it's portraying. Mining equipment includes a Cornish shovel and a crowbar, a bulling shovel, an oil lamp, and the dipping of candles, a spalling hammer, and the scales and weights needed to assess the pay of the miner. That's a better picture of the painting. Agricultural and other implements include tailor's shears, a cooper's adze, a hair comb, an ard, a pruning hook, a large frame saw, an iron cauldron, a mill rind, and what appears to be a manacle or hobble. We can also identify a cart, barrel, three ox yokes, harrow, three-legged cooking pot, a flail, a wool comb, a pitchfork, a billhook, and a hay rake. Two main industries seem to have dominated St Just at this time: the sea, both big ships needing serious navigation together with fishing, and mining with its ancillary industries of smithing, candle manufacture, and the like. It's likely that the barrels made by the cooper and the cooking pots were associated with the alehouse and cook shops, shown as a necessary adjunct to a mine. We now move to St Neot. The church and the village is named after St Neot, who died about 877 and was buried in the church. The Anglo-Saxon cross in the churchyard purports to be the one King Alfred gave to St Neot when visiting the village, and dates from the 870s. King Alfred, then a prince, visited St Neot sometime between 865 and 893. The church was dedicated in 1321, and the east end of the current church can be dated to the 1330s, but the majority of what can be seen today dates from between 1480 and 1530. The church is a fine example of its period, but its glory is the glass. Dating from the late 15th and early 16th centuries, almost the entire scheme survives, apart from the west windows destroyed in the Great Storm of 1704. They survived the Reformation and the Commonwealth. The churchwarden's accounts for the early 1651 read, "For a day's journey to Anthony Rouse to prevent the taking down of the church windows," which were then whitewashed. They were then shifted around and restored by Hedgeland in the 1830s. They show saints, narratives, and best of all, the donors, including the young men and the young maidens of the village. In all, there are 17 windows, a spectacular sight. There is in the church no sign of Sunday Christ. However, about 2000, an alert researcher spotted an unpublished drawing showing a Sunday Christ and panels of the Holy Kindred among Hedgeland's notes. Hedgeland had cut the window down and placed it in a dormer window above the pulpit. Some 10 years later, a search was instigated, and in a suitcase in the vicarage loft were found two small windows that had been removed when the dormer window was blocked up in 1880. One, rather fragmentary one, appears to show St. Mary Salome and her sons James and John. The other was the missing Sunday Christ. Both are now displayed in the Royal Museum of Cornwall in Truro. The St. Neot Sunday Christ is unique, the only known representation of this motif in stained glass. With what survives and Hedgeland's drawing, we can identify a number of items. Christ stands on a tiled floor, showing the 5 wounds and wearing a crown of thorns. Reading clockwise, we see a miner's needle, a spade, a peel with 2 small loaves on it, a sack of grain, a spindle, a bow, a pair of scales, a dice, gold coins, candles, a brace and bit, a sword, a playing card, a horseshoe, a spokeshave, a sheaf of corn, a hoist, a lantern, a rake, a wooden ladle, a miner's pick, a fire dog, a trivet, and a pair of pincers. Not altogether surprisingly, the community at St Neot is not a largely agricultural one. Wheat is being produced and processed, and we can trace the process from field to mill to baker. As ever, women are spinning. The trivet and fire dog may belong in the kitchen. But the vast majority of the items relate to the wealth that came with tin streaming and mining. St Neot is in the middle of the early tinning area, and it must have been that enabled an ordinary parish church to have the glass it did. It's a wealthy, violent, and lively place. They work hard, take risks, and then gamble, drink, and fight. The crane operator, the weighman, the blacksmith, and the lantern maker are kept busy, and the rewards are great, though possibly the risks involved may demand the services of the moneylender or the taxman. It must have been a very exciting place to live. This is the church of St. Ivid, of whom I know nothing, in Llanivet. The church is in the centre of the village, opposite school. The earliest religious building was probably a Celtic monastery, but the church of today is a heavily restored 15th century building. During the 1864 restorations, a number of wall paintings were discovered. However, it was felt impossible to conserve them, and so they were destroyed or covered over. The vicar of the time thought a couple worth recording, and one was the spectacular Sunday Christ, located in the South Aisle and at least 9 foot high. He drew it as a pencil sketch and recorded the colours used, so I've coloured a copy of his drawing, according to his notes. The figure of Christ has a cruciform nimbus and displays the wound in his side. There seem to be nail marks in his hands, and blood flows down the forearms, looking rather like tattoos. As at Brieg, clusters of blood drops are scattered all over the figure. Tools shown include an awl, a hat, a battledore, a pair of fulling shears, an axe, a bow, a horseshoe, a trap resembling a lobster pot. But given that it is about as far from the sea or a river as it's possible to be in Cornwall, quite possibly a bird trap. There's a distaff of flax and a spindle, a mallet, a jug, candles being dipped, a bucket, a pair of gloves, possibly representing falconry, a candlestick, a pair of scissors, a knife, a dice, a cup, and a hand holding a rectangular object, possibly a document with seal tags. The colours used were black, yellow, and red ochre, together with a brilliant red, which, given Cornish geology, was probably arsenic-based. Activities represented include carpentry, laundry, textiles, archery, fishing, candle making, gambling, drinking, and doing deals. So here we meet the woodworker, the blacksmith, the laundress, the linen spinner, the falconer, archers, maybe an allusion to the civil practice of archery on Sundays, fishermen, candle makers, gamblers, drinkers, the hat maker, and the lawyer. What's noticeable at Llanivet is the total absence of agriculture, arguing a much more urban existence. Llanivet lies just beside the main road that led from Bodwin westwards and was in an area of iron and tin workings. It seems to have been a varied community with enough money for leisure and hunting, as well as to support a notary or lawyer. Presumably there were farmers, but they seem to have been assiduous churchgoers. Brieg Church is built of granite and stands in a circular raised lan sanctuary in the middle of the village, probably built in the 12th century, by which time Breaca was named as its patron saint, and it was considerably enlarged from the 15th and 16th centuries. If you look in through the door, you see the Sunday Christ and St. Christopher wall paintings, and they're clearly designed to have been seen from outside. This is probably the finest example of a Sunday Christ in Britain. It probably originally painted in the late 15th century. The face and the outline have been retouched. Uniquely among these paintings, Christ is crowned. The figure is covered with wounds and blood, and there seems to be a real attempt to shock. Many of the implements are placed to appear to wound Christ, and spurts of blood link other items to his body. Analysis has shown this paint was water-based, and that in addition to the standard charcoal and ochre pigments, use is made of a copper-based green, probably verdigris, and almost certainly a byproduct of the local mining. Items shown in the lower half of the painting include a chisel, a pair of armourer's shears, a hatchet, a sickle, a clamp for boat building, a pair of shears, possibly of bronze, an anchor, a mill rind, a gaming board, possibly fox and geese, a mirror, a lute, a water wheel, a trowel, frame saw, a pair of tailor's shears, a wooden spoon, a pair of shears, a handsaw, a line winder, and a three-legged cooking pot. The upper left side of the painting is in poor condition, but even so, a number of interesting items can be identified. A spit with what seems to be fish impaled on it. This might be for cooking, or simply small, or possibly small fish-like pilchards prepared for smoking. A scythe blade pierces Christ's shoulder. A leather-working half-moon knife is, of course, there. A playing card showing the 5 of diamonds, which is possibly a reference to the 5 wounds of Christ. And below the auger is a spokeshave, and below the cart with 2 wheels. Under a second scythe or grasshook is a single-wheeled miner's barrow. On the right side, again, the top part is in poor condition. but seems to show a plough and some yokes for oxen. Below these are a beehive and a dark lantern, possibly emblematic of wrecking or mining. Both with local occupations. Save us, Lord, from rocks and shelving sands and death at Brig and Gurmo men's hands, runs the local proverb. Under Christ's armpit is what might be a covered cup, but seems more likely to be a fish trap, and a harp. Below the lantern is a wool comb. Brig around 1500 seems to be a cheerful and prosperous place, deriving income from a variety of sources. Set as it is between a copper mining area and the sea, both occupations feature strongly. There are indications of flour milling and a great deal of farming, including beekeeping. Bees must have thriven on the neighbouring moorlands. There seem to have been a number of craftsmen in Brig: the textile workers, wool combers, weavers, fullers, woodworkers such as sawyers and joiners, leather workers, and perhaps specialists such as horn workers and tool makers. The good life in Brig may have been catered to by travelling salesmen selling luxuries such as imported foods. They clearly enjoyed their food with extravagant spit roast foods, as well as the more conventional boiled goods. Gaming seems to have been popular, with card and board games played. Music also played a part. Noticeably, the instruments shown are more refined than in many villages. Both harp and lute are distinctly instruments of the home rather than the alehouse, while the mirror would have been an expensive item and is probably a dig at the squire's lady. We now move to South Wales. St Cubby's Church is set just off the main road down the Usk Valley, which runs through the centre of the village. There are no datable features earlier than the 15th century, but it's clear the perpendicular windows are inserted into existing walling. So the church is probably 13th or 14th century in essence. Outside is St Cubby's Well. Cubby was born in Cornwall, the son of Sullivan, whose tombstone is in the church at St Just, and was born about 480. He established several monasteries in Wales, all called Llancuby, but is said to have died here. In 2015, the church was temporarily closed as major problems were discovered with the walls and roof. Meanwhile, regular services continue to be held in the chancel, while the rest of the interior of the church is a solid mass of scaffolding. Unusually, the Sunday Christ is on the north wall of the chancel, mercifully at the moment because it means it's actually visible. Sadly, a fine neoclassical monument has destroyed some of it and is not in the best of condition. The painting is done in red, white, and black, and some of it seems more skillfully done than usual. There is a very fine pair of straight trumpets with a degree of modelling unusual in medieval wall painting. And the figure of Christ has a sense of movement. Recognisable items include a hunting horn, a sword, and what looks like a falconer's glove, suggesting that perhaps the local aristocracy were not diligent in their attendance. A set of scales suggests trade of some kind, while a pair of fuller's shears and a distaff suggests textile manufacture. A two-man frame saw suggests woodwork. As is often the case, there's a dedication cross between Christ's feet. Below the monument, we can see a 3-footed cauldron, a hayrake, some kind of spade or shovel, and an item that's either an anchor or a crossbow. No bowstring is visible, but an anchor seems an unlikely implement, though the River Usk isn't far away. The other carefully drawn item is some sort of fork on a wooden shaft. It doesn't really look like a pitchfork. It might be a pole arm of some sort, or a rest for a crossbow or arquebus. The emphasis of the implements seems to be on hunting and warfare, perhaps not surprising when one considers the location of the church on the Welsh borders. While the upper classes were engaged in slaughtering each other and the local wildlife, a reasonably prosperous community continued day-to-day life. The hayrake and what may be a pitchfork indicate the gathering of hay and corn. It's possible that the rather odd-shaped fork may be the tool in the bottom right corner, designed to carry hot vessels such as a fire pot. The shovel is another tool of the general labourer, suitable for any task between clearing stables and mixing mortar. Cloth production seems to have taken place on a commercial scale, with the sequence of processing between spinning and fulling. It's possible that the scales also refer to this industry, the weighing of fleeces. Cooking was probably mainly domestic, though the gentry may have employed a professional chef. Sawyers and blacksmiths would have been necessary to any size of community. What does seem to be missing is any suggestion of drinking, gambling, or music other than the trumpets, which are really a signalling instrument rather than music at that period. Llancuby appears to have been a hard-working community, getting by in the wild lands of the Welsh marches. Quite a large church for a small village, Michael Church Escley is just on the English side of the Welsh Marches and was heavily restored in the 19th century. The original church was built in the 12th century and enlarged in the 14th. The West Tower is from 1897. There are some undistinguished 18th and 19th century monuments, and the furnishings are late 19th, early 20th century. Overall, it does not look like a church to look at twice. But on the north wall is an enormous painting that probably once extended the whole height of the wall. Probably dating from the early 16th century, it's in good condition, though it seems to have been cut down a bit. Christ's hand displays the wound in his side, and the left, raised in an arresting manner, seems to call the passerby to stop and take notice. Many of the tools surrounding the figure can be seen to pierce or cut the flesh of Christ. The painting's blackish background makes it impressive, but it would once have been far more spectacular as it's been painted in red lead, which would have been bright scarlet. Sadly, it's reacted with the lime putty and turned black. Its use is unusual, as medieval painters were well aware of this problem. Quite possibly it's simply a byproduct of local lead mining. Some of the tools in the top left-hand corner are hard to be sure of, but they include a broad arrowhead, or just possibly a ploughshare, tailor's shears, wool shears, and a fine pair of fuller's shears. There's also a shuttle, a teasel board. I've produced the picture, maybe you can spot it there, used for raising the nap on fabric, a sword and a set of candles, and possibly a dice. Above Christ's head is a spade. At the top right is a cooper's adze, a large auger, a leatherworker's half-moon knife, together with a curved knife that is probably another shoemaker's tool, a pair of scissors and a millstone. There are 3 hand axes, a large frame saw, and 2 wooden wedges splitting tree trunks. I'm sure if I was a specialist in axes, I could tell you what all the individual axes are for, but unfortunately, I can't. In the lower left quadrant, we can see a maul, a gridiron, a large jug or tankard, a thatcher's wimble, which is for making straw rope, a burnisher, a claw hammer, and an assortment of knives and chisels. It's also clear something weird is going on round Christ's leg. Was there another figure there? Is it part of an earlier painting or a redrawing of the central group? Moving down the right side, we have a scythe blade, a peel, and a spinning wheel. That's really high technology for this period. So Michael Church at Escley was clearly a much larger community than it seems to have been more recently. As at Lancashire, we see a very stratified society, living in an area where the risks of living in border country are evident. The upper echelons are engaged in hunting, warfare, gambling, eating, and drinking. Not surprisingly, in what must have been a largely forested area, we see a lot of woodworking going on. More specialist knowledge of chisels and axes could probably tell us much more detail, but we would certainly meet the woodcutter and the cooper, as well as the carpenter and the wheelwright. As everywhere, the economy depended on the general labourer to dig the land and harvest the hay. A more specialist outdoor worker who seems to have avoided Sunday worship was the thatcher. From the fields, the grain went to the miller before being made into bread, possibly in a shared village oven. There's much time spent on the manufacture of clothes, from shepherd to spinner to weaver to cloth finishing to the tailor. The village also seems to have supported at least one leather worker, probably a shoemaker. So while the gentry at the castle led an exciting life of violence and indulgence, the vast majority got on with a reasonably prosperous village life. Now, Gumfreston in Pembrokeshire is a small and enchanting church just outside Tenby, mainly built in the 12th century and enlarged in the 14th. In the churchyard are not 1 but 3 holy wells, simply known as the church wells. Curiously, the oldest part of the building is actually the church porch. It's thought to be the first building on the site and the home of a monk or hermit who lived by the sacred springs. The church was then built onto it. When I phoned to check whether the church could be opened, I got the response, "Oh, it's always open. I don't think we have a key. The west door sticks a bit. Put your shoulder to it or go round to the priest's door." The notice on the door duplicates this information. Sadly, the wall painting is a touch underwhelming. This is a painting you really have to look at with the eye of faith, but mercifully the good folks at Cuffline, the Welsh Ancient Monuments, have provided a sketch which, while not perfect, does help a bit. At the left, we seem to have a baker's peel. Christ's lower legs can be guessed at, and between his feet are a pair of scissors. By his left leg is a teasel board, and above that possibly a frame saw. There's perhaps a hair comb, and clearest of all is a round sieve. A looped object beside it is visible but hard to identify. Perhaps a hobble like the one at St Just, or a miner's needle like the one at St Neot. So there's little to make a guess at what was happening in Gumfreston. Cloth making was clearly happening, and maybe the comb was also used in wool production. There was a baker with other facilities than the church to do his work. Gumfreston was in the coal mining area of Pembrokeshire. It's possible that some of the items are connected with mining or metal processing. Copper was brought across to Wales for processing because it was cheaper to move the copper than the coal. The sieve bears a resemblance to those illustrated in a mining manual of the period. However, it might equally be connected with the grain harvest or the kitchen. We don't know. St Tylo, the Church of St Tylo at Llanybont, is probably largely of 13th century construction and was extended by the addition of a south aisle in the 15th century. By 1984, it was in, to put it kindly, a ruinous condition, though traces of wall painting survived. It was decided to move it wholesale to the National Museum of Wales at St Fagans and to restore it as far as possible to the condition it would have been in just before the Reformation. So imagine my surprise and delight when, along with the Man of Sorrows and the Implements of the Passion, I met this. There is no evidence that there was a Sunday Christ at St Taylor's, but there are several recorded in South Wales. This seems based largely on Brieg, with details from several other paintings and additions of a quern and a cruth, which seem purely local and original. But this is certainly the newest Sunday Christ painting in the church and gives a great impression of what they would have looked like when new. For Oberziering in 1340 and Brieg in about 1500, Sancreed in the 1930s and St Fagans in the 21st century, ideas about the figure of Sunday Christ and St Sunday have changed. But all of them are at heart concerned with the role of Christ in the life of the community. And so I leave you with the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Okay, technically, he's making clay molds for candlesticks. And the parish priest stroke artist relaxing after his labours.
And you can just stop the.
There we go. So, unmute all.
People have to unmute themselves.
Very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, enjoyed that.
I just find them perpetually fascinating, those paintings. They tell us so much about the community, and it's so difficult to find out about what the ordinary person in the medieval period was actually doing and what they were like. And next week, what I'm planning on doing is more about the ordinary people connected with churches. I'm going to be looking at graffiti in churches.
Right.
Some medieval, some modern.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Really
Really interesting.
Catherine,
Yes.
your map showed 2 or 3 in Yorkshire. Where are the Yorkshire ones?
There are none surviving in Yorkshire. There are clusters of churches which have got records of a St Sunday.
Right, but they're not there now.
Nothing survives there, but there clearly were quite a few there, centering around Hull.
Right.
but nothing survives of those. I mean, that my map showed all places where we can say there were churches with. But I mean, places like Morbath, where the church warden's accounts have a whole flock of sheep allocated to providing candles for St Sunday at Morbath.
Right.
So we know there was one. And there are records, of a painting of St Sunday or whatever, or very often it's church warden's accounts saying something about provision. But so there obviously were in Yorkshire, but we haven't got any that survive. Maybe the iconoclasts were more brutal.
Right.
Actually, probably the increased wealth in the 19th century meant a lot of stuff was just painted out and scraped off. There was more restoring of churches. I mean, a lot of these churches are ones that really have not, for financial reasons, been able to do a fantastic amount of restoration and revamping. I mean, Gunfreston, I really sort of left in purely because while the painting is so obscure as to be almost unbelievable, it's such a lovely church. Anybody who gets a chance to visit it should. It's enchanting.